We are live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here at our Culture Dive Q&A with Andrea Nguyen and special guest Nguyen and Lê. And I'm here also with Juliet Jacobson, who is the two of us are Cooks Without Borders, like basically. So yeah, we're really excited to be here speaking about Vietnamese cooking with Andrea and Nguyen. I just want to tell you a little bit about Andrea first. So Andrea is the author of 6 books, including Into the Vietnamese Kitchen, the Pho Cookbook, which won a James Beard Cookbook Award, Asian Dumplings, the Banh Mi Handbook, Asian Tofu, and her latest book, oh, look at this, that's great. And her latest book is Vietnamese Food Any Day. She was also the editor of Unforgettable, The Bold Flavors of Paula Wolfert's Renegade Life, for which she won an IACP Cookbook Award. She has an amazing blog whose name just flew out of my mind, Andrea, because I'm a little bit brain dead today. It's called what is it called?
Viet World Kitchen.
Viet World Kitchen. Okay, I am so sorry. Yeah, so we're extremely excited to have her here. Her cookbooks are amazing, and we're just huge fans. Nguyen is an old friend who Juliet and I have both known for a really, really long time. I went to college with Nguyen, met her back in the early 80s. And Nguyen is an amazing photographer who has works in MOMA, the Whitney, LACMA, Art Institute of Chicago, other top museums around the country. She's won a million prestigious awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship. And right now, a retrospective of her work is at the Amon Carter Museum. So those of you who are in North Texas can go see that. I went this weekend, and it's totally amazing. And the reason Nguyen is with us is that she is also a wonderful home cook who cooks all kinds of foods, and including Vietnamese. And so she's a fan of Andrea's, and I think we'll have some great questions as well. But I think it'll just be a really good conversation. And the way it'll work is we'll all chat for, I don't know, half hour or so. If you have anything to add, there's a little chat on your right that you might open up if you haven't already. And then there at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Ask a Question. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask any of, either Andrea or Nguyen or any of us, just drop your question in there. We also put a poll in there, which was not as elegant as the 4 of us had sort of met before and talked about a fun poll, and we came up with this thing, but really what we had in mind was more of a survey. So I tried to kind of squish it into poll form inelegantly, but it's about the kind of ingredients you might have at home. So if you have a second to do that, that would be sort of fun. Without further ado, I actually wanted to, and then we'll take your question. We'll focus on your questions in the second half, although, maybe we'll pick up 1 or 2 along the way also. I wanted to, I didn't notice if this is one of the books that you held up on me. Is it Into the Vietnamese Kitchen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So this is Andrea's 2006 cookbook, and it's really like if you're going to own one cookbook about Vietnamese cooking, I would say this is like an amazing, and if you want to be into it really seriously, you can't do better than this. It's comprehensive, it's deep, it's serious, it's interesting. The recipes are wonderful, and I highly recommend it. But there was something in it that I thought could be sort of a great introduction to starting to speak with Andrea, and that is it's in the introduction of the book, and she's writing about the year 1975 when her family was in the midst of fleeing Vietnam. They were in Saigon as the war, as Saigon was about to fall. And so she's just writing about what that last day was like. And she said, "My mother squeezed her best jewelry, a couple of important photos, a bottle of water, 2 packets of dried instant noodles, and a small orange notebook filled with her handwritten recipes into her handbag. She decided she needed the recipes so that she and older sister Thien could open a restaurant in America. Surely, she thought, all the Vietnamese refugees heading for the States would want a bit of home to chew and savor. She guarded her handbag at all times, and the notebook traveled with us from Saigon to Guam to Hawaii and finally to California. So, Andrea, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I was wondering if you could just tell us, like, what happened to that little notebook.
Well, first off, thank you so much for spotlighting Vietnamese food and inviting me and on me to speak with everyone who's part of the community. And back in 1975, during those days, we didn't know what was going to happen, and we were among the luckiest of people to have flown out of Saigon as things were falling apart. And that little notebook came with us to California, where my parents were in a Vietnamese refugee resettlement camp called Camp Pendleton, which has been written a lot and movies have been made about it and stuff. And so we were there for about no longer than like 4 weeks. And when we got out, my mom started trying to figure out what to cook. And she would mine American supermarkets. She would also look in her notebook for guidance. And because those were like the flavors that she wanted. And she added to that notebook. The notebook was filled with handwritten recipes that she wrote, but also she had my sisters practice their penmanship by copying down recipes, because she was like, I'm going to give them a task. And she would find recipes that she liked in a newspaper or maybe something that a friend had given her. And so about half of the notebook, and it's this little flimsy notebook from the 1970s that has like this orange cover, and it's photographed into the Vietnamese kitchen. And so partway through, the recipes switch and they become American recipes for like brownies and spaghetti, because like those are like sort of the new things that we were discovering that we thought, oh, this is so exotic and novel. This is so interesting. I think we'll try to make 7-layer cookie bars, which she loved because they had coconut and she loved coconut. And then the recipe book continues with some of her own recipes of traditional Vietnamese things that she had tweaked here in the United States. For example, there are bánh cuốn recipes around Tết, which are steamed rice noodle sheets. Around Tết, she always made bánh chưng, which are square-shaped sticky rice cakes fashioned in the way of Northern Vietnamese style, because that's where she's from. So there are several iterations of that. There's also like a recipe that my dad all of a sudden started cooking when we came to the United States, and he was like the wonton man. I got wonton like duties to shape them, but he like carefully wrote down the recipe in meticulous details, organized and everything. And when that notebook was finished, all the pages are full, my mom started a recipe card file. So when Into the Vietnamese Kitchen published in 2006, she gifted me that little orange notebook. And she says to me, it's yours now. You can keep it. I have my recipe card box.
That's so
That's
great.
a great story. Is your mother still around?
Yes, she is 86 years old, and
Wow.
my father is not doing well. He's 90, and so she is currently, she's his primary caregiver. She still cooks. I'm
Amazing.
working on a new book project, and I had like this little steamed bao that I brought to her, and they're frozen in her freezer. And we just talked this morning. She said, let's get back to that bao that you made. I like the dough.
Is she critical of your cooking, or?
She respects it. She's very curious. She's a woman who's traditional. Her hair is still done traditionally. She wears jade bracelets that you hear jangling all over the house as she goes around cleaning. And it's almost like there's a certain, I don't know, sometimes it's kind of nightmarish to hear the clang, clang, clang because you hear her coming. in the house. But we talk a lot about food, and that's the relationship that I have with my mom, and it's a very special one. It's as if we're kitchen friends.
Nice.
Was there ever a time where you felt there was a transition and she trusted you, that you weren't her assistant anymore, but that you were an
A
equal
co-chef.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for asking about that, because I'm the youngest in my family of 5 kids, and there are 4 girls. So, one of my sisters is a pretty darn good cook. But my mom and I started collaborating on holiday family meals years ago, and there was a point where she just said, "You do it. I just want to watch."
That's an endorsement.
Yeah, and then after the first book came out, Into the Vietnamese Kitchen, she started pushing it to all of her lady friends. And she said, "You give this to your children because you're not writing your recipes down, and they need something for when they get married." So she was like one of my best book salespeople.
Oh, that's great.
And she's made like entire meals out of the book, and she will happily say, "I made this, and this is my entire menu was from your book. I'm so glad you wrote these things down in so much detail, because I can't remember exactly what happens."
That's great.
Do you have a sense of your audience and like what percentage of them are Vietnamese, and what percent are sort of newcomers to the cuisine?
Most of the people who started out cooking from my books are not Vietnamese, and they still are not. I think that over time, people have come out and said, "Oh yeah, I have your book," or "I reference it all the time." But most of the people I came in contact with at the beginning were not Asian. They were, they were white people who were very curious about Vietnamese food. But over time, and I didn't know I was going to have a career in this, ladies. I mean, I was just like, this is going to be my first, one and only first record. I'm going to put everything into it. But over time, I've been able to produce more works, and there have been younger people coming on, Asian Americans from all different backgrounds, and that's brought me a lot of joy, because frankly, there's a lot of content out there. But I think that what I offer to people, and I tell people, especially like Vietnamese people, because they're so darn competitive, right? I say, this is my method. And if and people say, my mother and my grandmother won't tell me what they do, and they don't measure anything. And I say, well, you make my recipe, then you go to them and you say, this is what this woman says. And how do we do it differently? And ask them to add to your knowledge.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
So that it's non-threatening, or actually it becomes more kind of competitive to them. And they will also understand that you're interested in cooking.
Yeah.
A lot of times, and you may have found this with your grandmother too, that the cooking is part of their identity and their gift to their family. And so letting that go would almost mean like, oh, I don't have a role anymore.
And
my grandmother we would go to a restaurant, especially a Vietnamese restaurant, sometimes even Western, and we would love something, and she would love it too. But then, she would start, I could see it in her face. She would start breaking down, like, what is it made of? How is it cooked? And then a few days later, she would serve it, as a point of pride. And it, that competition, I can just do, she just wants to bring pleasure. So if we got pleasure there, she felt she could do the same. But yeah, it's competitive.
That's interesting. What it was, Andrea, what you said about sort of cooking as identity and those foods as identity. Can you talk about that a little bit? About like you didn't know you were going to do this for a living, and in fact it wasn't really your first profession. Like, what does food mean to you, and what does the food of Vietnam mean to you? And on me, I'd love to hear this from you as well. Like how was that? how does that sort of come into your life as an immigrant? You know, are there particular flavors or dishes that you miss? And what does it all kind of mean? If you could talk about what it means for you.
Well, I left Vietnam at a very young age, at 6 years old. I was plump as a child. I was lucky. I mean, they're mostly like skinny kids in Vietnam because, you know, it's like an impoverished country. But my mother made sure that we were well fed. And that was a fortunate thing. So I, you know, remember eating my first bowl of pho when I was like around 5.5 in a restaurant where I finished the entire bowl on my own with chopsticks and spoon, and my parents were so proud.
It's an achievement.
Yeah. And I remember hanging out with our cook when we went to go grocery shopping at the wet market around the corner from the house. I remember, you know, working the hand crank meat grinder to make pate, and how cold the grinding mechanisms were and how sharp they were, even though I was very young. So those are impressionistic memories of food. So my I don't speak Vietnamese very well. I speak like a child. But what I do know about is food. And so for me, that is how I may root myself. So I read Vietnamese cookbooks. I will like, you know, I'll watch YouTube, and that's how I like polish my knowledge of my culture. And I read about it, you know, both in Vietnamese and in English. And I even have a few works in French that I don't understand. I went, you know, they sent us to like French language schools when we were young, but I wasn't in Vietnam for very long. So that's really not part of my my language skills. But all of those things pour into what I understand to be Vietnamese. And the beautiful thing about Vietnamese culture is that it is an amalgam. So it's East and West. It's East Asia, it's Southeast Asia, it's South Asian, it's a bit of, you know, Europe, and now it's America and Australia and all these different places poured into one. And I think that is why I'm so interested also to investigate, you know, this particular cuisine and see where the tentacles like an octopus go, because then I can see the connections. And there are connections once that you dive deep enough, you make the food, and then you realize the hand movements are really so similar.
The hand movements
when let's say you're making a dumpling, or even there are formulas for doughs that, you know, and that you just say, oh, these formulas kind of replicate themselves. You know, in Vietnam, we make certain kinds of dumplings that oftentimes they come from, are influenced by the Chinese. And then when I was working with Paula Wolford on her cookbook biography, there was a point where I looked at her and I was like, Paula, it's the same formula as what you have here from North Africa, or you know, the Northern Mediterranean area, and it's because they're just ingredients. You know, and yet we can connect with one another. And also just like through like tomatoes. I think about tomatoes a lot because, you know, it's native to the Americas, but when we use them in Vietnamese cooking, we don't necessarily use ripe tomatoes. We use sort of unripe firm tomatoes called cà chua, which is like sour eggplant translated. Because we think about tart elements. We're like, you know, so because it's adding a texture and a flavor that we're looking for. So a lot of times, like, you don't see ripe tomatoes in the Vietnamese marketplace in Vietnam. They're almost like really firm and hard, and you're like, why do you want to eat these things? It's because they're looking for that tartness and that firmness of the flesh for their purposes, because it's cà chua. It is a tart eggplant.
So interesting. I never heard that before.
Yeah, I hadn't either, and that's it's there. At least it's easier to find hard tomatoes than most times of year. So, how about you and me? What is that? You know, that sort of like what does Vietnamese food mean to you, and what's sort of your relationship with it? I know you cook all kinds of food, but does it mean something to you?
Oh, it means everything to me, and I'm so grateful that Andrea is spending all this time and energy, coming up with new recipes and polishing methods of cooking. I think when you live in exile, you don't have much. You have food and literature and perhaps music. So I mean, I've had two experiences even before the end of the war and coming to the United States as a refugee. I lived in Paris for 5 years when I was younger, and my grandmother was living there. So we lived in this dreary housing project. I was going to school, and the French kids are not always the most accepting. But coming home, my grandmother was there, smoking and listening to Vietnamese music and trying to recreate these recipes. So this is the late '60s. So she had fish sauce, but she would be sending me out looking for cilantro, which was called Chinese parsley,
Right.
or scallions, which is Chinese,
Spring
chives,
onions.
and it was not easy. But she would recreate. So we'd have pho with spaghetti, right? But then she would try to. So we learned to adapt, but it brought so much comfort, and I think she really tried to give us a sense of home and a sense of Vietnam. So food always meant everything to me, and I learned from her all the gestures that Andrea talked about. Whether it's chopping finely, making the bánh hồng. I think she even tried at one point, and different things. So I think going back to Vietnam for a few years before the end of the war, I just kind of gobbled up all the food and was so happy. And then coming to the United States was like another shock. But I think it was a lot easier, to find Mexican ingredients or other Asian ingredients and try to make up for it. But it's about home. It's about comfort. I think it's also the one part that was not problematic. Growing up in the 80s, you associated Vietnam with the war, the vets, and it was so controversial. There were so few pictures of actual Vietnam. You would find war pictures and you would find colonial pictures, but there was nothing other than that, or tourist pictures. So I think that my default was always to grab on to food because it brought so much pleasure, so much comfort, and so much happiness.
Yeah. How old were you, Anmi, when you left Vietnam?
I was 15, so I mean, I was a teenager, so I remembered everything.
Yeah.
And then I was 8 the first time when we moved to Paris for a few years.
And then, you came to, you found like finding those ingredients in California was a lot easier than finding them in France.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. And there was already, a Filipino community. The fish sauce was not difficult to find, and cilantro, scallions, and eventually, everything came. But I think that I didn't have a recipe book, but somehow the taste was so ingrained in my memory, and that's why we had an interesting discussion that we started right a few days ago about what it means for someone who's not tasted some of those dishes to try to follow your recipe, and what do you suggest to those home cooks who may not have tried a bún bò or a more intricate dish in a restaurant and try to start from scratch.
Yeah.
Where do you stop, and how do you know whether you've come close to creating the dish?
No, that's one of the hardest things, because I could write about meatballs, but I can't write about meatballs because there are plenty of other people who write meatball recipes that are absolutely fabulous. So in my niche, it's really introducing dishes that people are unfamiliar with. And, I'm lucky to be able to have that niche and to be able to, introduce these new flavors. And for example, I wrote a story for the Los Angeles Times a couple of years ago about hủ tiếu. And I have to tell you, so we know pho from, that's in the north, from the north of Vietnam. We know bún bò Huế, which is spicy and gutsy, and it's from the central region. But hủ tiếu from the southern region is just like crazy ass. I mean, it's like I would talk to people and they'd be like, well, you can have it with broth, without broth. You can have it with this noodle, a rice noodle, or you can have it with an egg noodle, or you can have it with a chewy tapioca noodle, or you can have it dry, you can have it wet, you can have pork, you can have chicken, or you can have shrimp, or you can have it all together. And have I told you that I'm thinking of making a vegetarian version? That seems really hard. And it was like so crazy to try to figure that out, but yet I was writing a story about something that a lot of people hadn't, most LA Times food section readers had never ever tasted. So I had to like paint, you know, the noodle dish as like this kaleidoscopic thing and hang it on. Okay, so if you've had pho, you've had bún bò Huế, you gotta try, you know, hủ tiếu because it's so Southern Vietnamese. It's like this crazy mixture of cultures. It's, you know, Chinese, it's Cambodian, it's Southern Vietnamese, it's all this color, and you can have it your way because the Vietnamese in the South are just like, they're, you know, they're kind of like renegades. And
indulgent, like
yes,
everything, the best.
Everything. They live large.
So
And so I pour all of that in just to get people into like the vibe of the soup. And then it's like, okay, so now we're going to talk about the flavors.
it's hard to write about flavor.
It is. So, you know, and a lot of people who cook cuisines that are unfamiliar to them, they first try it at, you know, a restaurant or a deli or somewhere. But because I am creating new recipes and such, I have to use my words to sell them on this concept. For example, like caw, dishes that are made with a bittersweet caramel sauce and fish sauce, and they're simmered for a long time. You know, it's a very important category of food in the Vietnamese repertoire. But like explaining it, you know, and then you're like, what? Is this the caramel sauce that you put on ice cream? Yeah. I mean, there's like all of these things that I really, frankly, you know, it's like over and over and over again over the years to repeat, and I polish and hone my words over time. But I'm also at this stage in my career thinking about modern Vietnamese cooking too, instead of just like old school stuff. And that's in many ways quite liberating to not have to cook the way my mother used to, and she doesn't even cook the way she used to.
Yeah,
She uses your cookbook now.
Right.
It's you know what you're saying about, you know, about those recipes and trying to, you know, have people understand it. In a way, it reminds me of this whole conversation going on in, you know, in the food writing world, and, you know, with the idea of recipes and should we have to follow recipes, and you know, there was kind of that there was a bit of a blow up over you know, Sam Sifton wrote that book, you know, basically like, oh, you don't need recipes, and, you know, I think there was a bit of a backlash, and there's this, and then there was a really good essay by who wrote that essay in the New York Times? Was it now I can't remember who wrote it, but the idea was like, hey, this is why we follow recipes, because if you have a really good recipe, you know, in a way, those of us who are like comfortable cooks, confident cooks, it might be hard for us to really follow a recipe because we have this idea like, oh, I know better. But sometimes when we're exploring cuisines that we don't know yet, it's often better to really follow a recipe, and that's when you want a really great recipe. And that's where, like, we're just so thankful for Andrea, because we can follow your recipes, and actually if you follow it, you're going to get something. I mean, that's my experience with your recipes. Like, you actually do get some, like, I don't know because I haven't been to Vietnam, but it sure tastes good.
It's a way to learn, you know.
So Genevieve Coe wrote the piece about following a recipe. So Genevieve, I know Genevieve, I've worked with her at the LA Times and the New York Times, and she got so much you know, so much backlash on that piece because people are like, I don't want to follow a recipe. And why are you saying that? And the thing is that, and the thing is about Sam Sifton's book is that there are recipes in there. He tells you it's just not a regular recipe format.
Yes.
And some people don't want to follow recipes or they want to take detours. He has quantities in there. When a recipe does not have quantities, like old school recipes where they were what we call now talk throughs. So as a paragraph, they'd be like, for example, I have an old cookbook called La Bib Doi, which was written in the 1940s. It's the Vietnamese equivalent of The Joy of Cooking. And the pho recipe in there is about, it's only 1 inch long. I mean, when you look at the it's like one paragraph. And at the end, she says, and if you really want to make it well, you use beef fillet and a little MSG. And I mean, and that's like, and people knew what the flavor of pho is. So what I'm saying is that, we used to have a body of cultural knowledge in America about certain foods. Like James Beard, set this, he had there was a certain vocabulary. There was certain kinds of recipes that Americans made, set forth by the Joy of Cooking, by Better Homes and Gardens, by Craig Claiborne and James Beard and many other authors. So people kind of knew what to do and you could kind of wing it, right? But nowadays, because we're cooking much more global flavors, people want to wing it sometimes too, based upon their impressions of things. So Sam's No Recipes recipe book offers you that the opportunity, but he does it very skillfully because he introduces the Sichuan noodle dish, and he's like, oh, you just throw it together. You can use gochujang, and he assumes that American cooks have gochujang and fish sauce and Chinese black vinegar, along with olive oil and canned sardines in their larder. Yeah. So that is really the New York Times smart cook. Yeah. That may not be every cook in America. Right. And then what Genevieve is talking about, and I love to follow recipes written by cooks that I trust, because I feel like they're in the kitchen with me and they can take me anywhere. Because I want to learn how they cook, how they interpret a dish, how they interpret ingredients. And so every once in a while, I do follow a recipe because I'm just like, I want to know what their flavor profile is. Even down to when they say chop, what do they mean? But that's, the geek in me.
Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about your creative process? Because we've talked a lot about your, at this point about more about traditional recipes, but also for instance, in Vietnamese food any day, and also you're talking about getting more into contemporary contemporary Vietnamese cooking. When you conceive, can you talk about what that's like for you to conceive of a dish, and
Sure.
Do you feel any kind of the constraints of what kind of constraints do you feel or not feel, or how do you approach that?
I feel constraints all the time because I feel like there is going to be someone who comes at me and says, you're doing it wrong. In Vietnamese, we have this term "com dung," and people love to slap it at you.
What does com dung mean?
Com dung, com is negation, so it's no, and dung is correct. Oh. So it's like, you're wrong.
Not correct.
But it's almost an insult to your intelligence as well as your parents and your grandparents going back way, 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 because you're just you're an idiot and you're morally corrupt. Yeah, shame on you. You're you're just a bad person. So there's just a finger wagging business, So I'm very careful to, whenever I present a recipe, and Juliet brought up a great example of that. So in Vietnamese food any day, there are these little beef patties called curry-scented beef patties. And she made them last night. And I conceive of those because it's my shortcut to ba la lo. And because I love that dish, but getting the wild betel leaf, the la lot leaves, is very difficult. They're only available at hardcore Vietnamese markets, or if you're in the tropical, subtropical South, you can grow them. But how many of us are doing that? And I write for people who are all over the place cooking. But what I noticed over the years is that there is this curry scent that the leaves give off. So then I was like, how can I build that into the beef mixture that is typically used? Because they're like ground beef that you mix with aromatics and then you roll up in this leaf. And the leaf itself, when raw, it doesn't have that much flavor, but when it's heated, it releases this incense curry-like flavor that's just like, so good. And I was like, how can I do that, but without the leaf? So in the recipe head note, I explain what la lote is. And I was like, you don't have it, I don't have it, and this is what I do. It's my little cheat, and I liberate you to take that cheat too.
And it was delicious.
Thank you. So oftentimes, because of my past work, people will approach me, other cookbook authors, as well as like just, home cooks. And they're like, oh, you're really hard ass. Do you make you make fresh tofu at home every week? I'm like, no. I know how to make tofu. I wrote a whole book that includes how to make tofu in it, but I buy a lot of my own tofu. And so, do you make dumpling wrappers from scratch all the time? Not all the times. I have my lazy days. A lot of days are lazy days, especially nowadays. And so, it's like, I feel with Vietnamese food, there are so many Vietnamese people who are doing these modern things, but and I see it all the time in like Vietnamese cookbooks and online, but we always people want to see the old school stuff.
Yeah.
Because somehow that's like the send up to tradition and its pride and everything. But what are people really cooking at home?
Well, but it's also, you have a touchstone with the authentic original dish that someone like me doesn't have. And so you acted in that recipe, you form a bridge between that thing that you've sampled that I never have and maybe never will, and what I can make at home. So I really appreciated that bridging between the authentic and something that was doable.
Yeah. So, what I really see myself doing is bridging. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because we can't, as soon as people like me and I and our families left Vietnam,
right,
we cannot cook that kind of authenticity. But as I explain in Vietnamese Food Any Day, there's this term called kale, and kale means it means skillful, it means informed, it means rooted. And we apply it into so many different aspects of Vietnamese living. And in the kitchen, it means that you have some understanding, some foundation, so that you cook something with intention and purpose. It's deliberative. It's not like the other word in Vietnamese, hâm ba lan, which is like, I just throw everything in, the kitchen sink, which is something that I don't like about recipes. They're like, kitchen sink cookies. And I'm like, no. It's not, because I've tried throwing things together into a bowl and trying to make cookies. No, there is a formula. And that is, you may call it kitchen sink to hook somebody, but it's just a good cookie that you created.
Yeah. Baking is an exact science, as I think Francois Mitterrand once said. Because Anmi's mutual friend, we have a mutual friend, Danielle Delpeux, who was his she was the chef at the family chef at the Élysée Palace, and I don't know, she screwed something up, and he chided her, saying that cooking is maybe he said cooking. Do you remember the story on me? Cooking is an exact science.
I think he said baking is an exact science. Yes. Yes.
So,
but not cooking. Yes.
Yeah, cooking not so much, but can we talk for a minute about the French influence in Vietnamese cooking, and how both of you sort of view that? Do you separate it out in your mind at all, or does it, like, how do you feel about the kind of colonial part of it? Like, And has that changed over time, the way you feel about that?
Maybe I should let Anmi go because she actually
No,
lived
no,
there.
no, no. Well, I'll jump in, but I was hoping you would say something first. I feel that it's quite separate, right? In some ways, and so I never felt that it was a threat. I thought that French culture brought all kinds of great things. Is it true that bread came from the French culture? Certain pastries, but I never felt that. And perhaps we took the stew, right? The French stew and made it into a Vietnamese curry or Vietnamese stew with anise and cinnamon and other things, but I never felt that there was too much butting heads, and it seemed that maybe there was a coming together at some part, but I felt it stayed pretty separate. I mean, do you know the history of Vietnamese cooks who worked in French families back in the colonial times?
There
They
were,
learned the
yeah.
French recipes probably from a cookbook, and then I don't know if they were ever asked to cook Vietnamese food, but probably not.
Yeah,
But
I have a
there's
feeling they didn't. And there were some Vietnamese cooks who traveled with French colonials back to France. And some of them are part of the pho origin stories. But the pho origin story that I like to tell is that the French were in Vietnam. They wanted their beefsteaks, and they started slaughtering a lot of cows. This is all around, the turn of the century, the 20th century. And the Vietnamese suddenly had all of these chewy beef cuts and bones and stuff to deal with. And so they combined these scraps that were really like a byproduct of the French desire for beef. And then there was also this local water buffalo noodle soup dish that was being prepared by Chinese street vendors. And then they swapped, because there was a sale on beef. And so they swapped the beef for the water buffalo, and they changed up the noodles. And the noodles were Chinese style rice noodles, round noodles. They changed it for flat ones. And they added, local spices, star anise, black cardamom, cassia, cinnamon, and they created this dish. And that became pho. And the same thing with banh mi. So
Yes, what I was going to say.
the French brought baguette, and somehow the Vietnamese managed, and they were mostly Chinese Vietnamese bakers, managed to bake these lofty loaves in tropical, humid Vietnam out of really like low protein flour. The flour wasn't that good. And so they had to manipulate the dough somehow so that it got that rise every single time.
Yeah.
And first it was like, with pate. And if you were, my dad, who's 90, so he remembers like going to school, and he said, if you had 1 cent, một xu, 1 xu, 1 cent, you could get a loaf, a little ball of dough. And they were round. He said they're fist size. And the vendor would like sell them underneath this burlap fabric and unveil them. And he said, and if you had 2 cents, then you get a little smearing of liver pate.
Okay.
And that was banh mi for him.
Huh.
And so it was like this really, and the Vietnamese wanted to have these, sandwiches. And once they got down to the South, they like we talk about hủ tiếu. Shoot, they put everything in there, mixed up deli meats, pate. And because butter is a pricey ingredient in Vietnam, what everybody has are eggs and oil and a little acid. You can make mayonnaise. And you just like, they didn't have machines, they had whips that they're like working. And combining it with, Chinese roast pork with Vietnamese cold cuts. And then you got the pickles, and then, the chilies that the Portuguese had brought over. cilantro, cucumbers, and then all of a sudden you have the modern banh mi sandwich in Saigon style, which is then
Making my
exported
mouth
to the
water.
United States.
Yeah.
So it's not like, in certain regards, there's an entire French repertoire in that cookbook that I mentioned earlier. Like 2/3 of the cookbook is Vietnamese, 1/3 are French dishes. And then there are dishes that are like these culinary mashups that are the result of reverse cultural appropriation, where the Vietnamese are like, no, you don't own us. We own you now. We took your bread. We took your mayonnaise. We took your butter. We took your pate. We took your Maggi seasoning sauce that you brought over with you, and we turned it into our sandwich. Because banh mi used to be called banh mi Tây. Tây means Western or French. And then people were eating banh mi so often, after a while, they dropped the Tây part. They just like, this is banh mi. This is something that is made out of wheat bread.
Yeah.
So it is this cultural survival aspect. So whenever people talk about cultural appropriation and colonization, I say to them, look, in the case of Vietnam, we always seek self-empowerment and self-determination. We're looking for empowerment and determination. And so we do this cultural appropriation where it's like it turns the tides on things. And eventually the Vietnamese kicked the French out. Now, the thing that's interesting that you brought Mitterrand up is that, so Paul Bocuse, the late Paul Bocuse had this famous dinner at Élysée Palace where he baked a soup for Mitterrand that was under the cover of puff pastry, and inside had truffle and stuff like that. So my parents knew this Vietnamese man who was a very good businessman in Saigon. And then he comes to America and he's a really good entrepreneur. And he took some cooking classes from Bocuse in France. And he learned that particular recipe, which was published in Bocuse's, one of Bocuse's cookbooks that was eventually translated into English. So Mr. Lup, who's he was a really good hustler. And he owned these wonderful French Vietnamese restaurants. There were French restaurants in the Bay Area. He always put a little nook mum in everything. And so one of the things he was made was this Paul Bocuse soup. And he'd be like, oh, he served this to Mitterrand. And then
added fish sauce.
And there's always a little fish sauce in there. And so that's the little, Vietnamese thing. It's we're going to put our little stamp on it and we're going to own it. So then it gets to my mom, and my mom's making this soup and serving it to all of our Vietnamese and our Western guests that come to the house. So there's this thing of oh yeah, the French were there. We kicked them out. We can make French food. We can make Vietnamese food. We can make Chinese food. We're Vietnamese. Because on Me's grandma, it's we can figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. I mean, that is such a great story and such a great way to see it. And we have all these sort of fusion cuisines that people get very offended by, and the whole cultural appropriation conversation around food is so wrought, and the authenticity question, if it's not authentic, if it's not based on some traditional thing, then it's not legitimate. But without those kinds of evolutions and those kinds of interesting attitudes towards, I love that kind of reversal. Okay, we're kicking you, we're taking what you thought you were kicking our butt, we're kicking your butt. I really love that. And because without that, there is no sort of evolution in, there's no we wouldn't have the banh mi sandwich. And,
right.
It's really,
and the world would be a worse place.
I wanted to say that those attitudes, take a long time to change, because even though the French were kicked out, I think the Vietnamese elite still thought of speaking French and French things as being more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I remember in the late 60s when we were living in Vietnam, and my mom had some foreigners over for dinner, and she called up, my grandmother was still living in France then, so she called up this aunt and said, what should I cook and all this stuff. And the aunt started suggesting these French dishes and this sophisticated stuff. And my mom said, no, 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 we should cook Vietnamese. We should cook Vietnamese. And the aunt just couldn't understand. But they cooked a Vietnamese meal, and it was, and it was great. So I think it's like steps to get away from what the standard is, and just as much as you come to somebody's house and they think that you're a great guest and they want to serve the French butter, well, actually, we would rather have the Vietnamese dish, I'd rather go to the market and have the food at the market. So I think it has to do with pride and a kind of empowerment, and it takes time for all of that to happen.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. My mom, for many, many years, if we had Western guests over, she served them Vietnamese food. And if we had Vietnamese food over, she served them French food. But now, post-COVID, she's 86 too. If she has people over, she makes Vietnamese food. Because she's also thinking, the stuff you make or you get out because you eat out too much, it's going to be bad. So you need some home-cooked food.
So I have a whole bunch more questions, but maybe we should take a minute in case nobody's dropped questions in. But if anybody has a question, we would love to address it. So I'll just throw that out there. Feel free to drop it in. And then meanwhile, can you, Andrea, can you tell us what you're working on now? You're working on a new book, right?
Yeah, so I'm working on a vegetable-centric cookbook, and having a blast taking a look at, ways to get people to eat more vegetables. This is something that I've transitioned over in the last few years because I hit midlife, and I'm going through perimenopause, and perimenopause makes you reevaluate many things in your lifestyle. And I had some health challenges that made me realize that even though I had a healthy diet, that I just needed to really start reorienting my self to eat a more vegetable-centric diet. And most of Vietnamese food is very vegetable-centric. But frankly, like when we came to America, all of a sudden there was all this affordable meat. And so you start centering your meals around meat, around animal protein. And so even though we talk about, eating jai, which is vegetarian food, and you don't have to be like a strict vegetarian, you don't have to be a Buddhist to eat jai. And you don't even have to use soy sauce. You can use fish sauce, but you're just eating more vegetables. It's like this way of eating that I find to be so life-giving now, in this stage of my life. And so I'm going to write a book about it, and we're in recipe testing. And
so it's not vegetarian per se, but it's more plant-based.
Well, plant-based, it implies that it's all vegetarian, but it's not.
But it's not.
It's
plant forward, vegetable forward.
Yeah, vegetable forward, plant forward, plant centric is more the terms. Low meat eating. Most of the recipes are vegetarian or vegan.
But it's Vietnamese flavors.
Yes. So it's a lot of research and dreaming and having a really good time. Just seeing what's going on out there in Vietnam and here, and modern stuff and old school recipes too. It's very, it's pushing me to just think differently. Because when you look at we know how to cook meat because meat tends to be standardized. Like ground meat, okay, you understand how it functions more or less. But vegetables are so diverse. And there are a lot of things about vegetables that we've forgotten because we eat just a limited range of vegetables too. The supermarket, you only see so many things.
Right.
But nowadays the farmers markets have so much going on, and I think it's really, really exciting. And when I talk to my parents about it, especially my mom, she loves it because she after my siblings left for college or went off to work and stuff, I was home with my parents, and I was in high school then, junior or senior, and they served me like these really like homey dishes that were mostly vegetables. And they really dug that food. It wasn't, and so I go back to those flavors and I think about them and how I can make them super healthful. And when I go to visit my parents, I push the vegetables a lot when I'm cooking for my mom for dinner, and she just loves it.
And how are you handling the fish sauce part of it? Are you not being strict about that, or are you?
You can use fish sauce or a vegan fish sauce, and I have ways to deal with the vegan one. So
what's in vegan fish sauce that makes it
what
fishy?
is vegan fish sauce?
Can't tell you, or I'd have to kill you.
Double top secret.
Will there be a recipe for it in your new book? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
You can purchase it, but from hardcore Vietnamese markets. There's also a version that's sold at like Whole Foods. But in all honesty, I don't think that those versions are great. They're and so I created something that can go 1-to-1 with regular fish sauce. And if you're like into eating vegetables, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, your palate tends to be lighter too.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you don't want flavor, but when you're cooking with vegetables, they have a lot of ability to pop in terms of flavors. They don't require as much seasoning per se as like animal protein does.
Right.
And
That makes sense.
yeah, and so it's very experimental. It's very exciting for me. But if you don't want to go with a vegan fish sauce, you use regular fish sauce, and it'll be fine.
And when is this book going to come out?
Beginning of 2023.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah.
So
I want it now.
I have.
So
We need to wrap up pretty soon, but I have one more question, and this probably also we have time for anybody else to ask a question too. But Andrea, you I'm trying to remember if this was in one of your books or on your blog, but you talked somewhere about every evening when you are about to have dinner and your husband asks you how you would like him to set the table. Can you tell us about that and why it's not always the same?
Sure. So my husband's white. We don't eat Vietnamese food or Asian food all the time. And if we eat Asian food, it could be a variety of, it could be South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian. And sometimes we combine things. And so when I was growing up, and even like when we're like setting the table at my parents' house, we're like, what are we having? Is there a dipping sauce? And then my parents are so damn formal. They're like, how many dipping sauces? Because you can't have the same dish for the same dipping sauce. And I'm just like, calm down. And so just on a regular basis, we go through, what are we eating? Do we need a rice bowl or not? And if we have a rice bowl, then we'll have a little salad plate for holding other dishes. And if we have a rice bowl, then chopsticks and a Chinese soup spoon. And are we going to have a little dipping sauce or not? So everything just builds. And sometimes even if we're having Vietnamese food, we'll just say there's like no soup involved, no can, which is a quickie soup, no dipping sauce. We'll just eat it on a plate. And the thing with Vietnamese dining is that you can use chopsticks and spoon. You can use fork, knife. You can use Eastern or Western. Just depends on what you're eating. Mm-hmm. And there is no compared to say Japanese or Korean formalities, there are fewer formalities in Vietnamese food. And sometimes you're eating with your hands. So you may want chopsticks to retrieve things, but most of the time you're using your hands to eat with. Mm-hmm. So we always go through this, and on top of that, if we're having rice paper wraps that we're doing at the table, then we have to get Mr. Rice Paper, Mr. Spring Roll out, which is like this water dipping vessel. And so
Mr. Spring Roll.
Mr. Spring, he goes, do you want Mr. Spring Roll today?
I love that.
Yeah. We've been married a long time.
Cool.
So we
Well-
go through this, and so I always thank you for asking about that, because I think that people feel like they can like mess up, but there's really like you can't really mess up with Vietnamese food. I just one thing I tell people is that do not put like if you're eating noodle soups with like a wedge of lime, do not put that spent wedge of lime into your bowl. It is a piece of trash. It is set down on a plate because food is not a cocktail. I see that all the time in photos, and it's so wrong.
Yeah.
That's you put it in, and it can lime has bitterness. It can release into your bowl, and I just don't know why that's done. I think stylists just want something pretty for texture for these beauty shots, but it's just so unrealistic. That's not how Vietnamese people eat our noodle soups.
Yeah. Well, I think our
some insider
time,
knowledge.
Our time is up, unfortunately, but I want to thank you all. Thank you both for being here. Thank you so much. And
Thank you,
you know,
Andrea,
once again,
Thank
I
you.
highly recommend Andrea's books. You can find them at Cooks Without Borders, through our bookshop, and of course on Amazon and bookshop itself.
Oh, I want that one.
Yeah, and please, and you can follow Andrea. What's your Instagram handle, Andrea?
Oh, it's Andrea Nguyen 88.
And me, what is your Instagram handle?
My Instagram, it's ANMYNX.
And if you're in a city where Anmi's show is coming through, you absolutely need to see it.
In Carter.
Where is it
sorry?
going after Texas?
And it's going to St. Louis. No, not St. Louis. It's going to Milwaukee.
No, I'm not going to be there either.
Well, then come and see it in North Texas.
Okay, good idea.
Yes, and
Thank
you're invited
you so
too,
much,
Andrea.
Andrea. We use your books all the time. My son has your book at college. And,
Oh,
so thank you for everything.
Well, hopefully when you're in California or if I'm in New York, we can meet in person.
Absolutely. We'll have a feast.
yeah,
So thank you both so much, and this will be available on YouTube and at the Cooks Without Borders YouTube channel. So share it with everybody, and we'll see you all soon.
All right. Bye.
Hey,
Thank you,
so
Leslie.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.